On today's Locked On Giants podcast, the New York Giants kick off OTAs this week, and here are a few of the things that I'll be looking for.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all my written work. And as always, welcome on into my Blue Crew community members, my everydayers, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast, and hope everybody had a nice long weekend. We're on the tail end of Memorial Day weekend, so those of you who are kicking back and relaxing, hope it's been a good one for you. All right, now the Giants, they start OTAs on Tuesday. They're obviously off today on Monday, but they do start OTAs, which is phase 3 of the offseason program, on Tuesday. Now, the media is not going to be in the building until Wednesday. Wednesday, we'll get a chance to take a look at, what the offense versus the defense and basically the whole team, get our first opportunity. But there are certain storylines, if you will, that I'm going to be keeping an eye on. And before I get into those, just real quick, a reminder of what we can and can't see at the OTAs. What we will not see is contact drills, all right? That is not permitted because, quite honestly, they're not allowed to wear pads, all right? So they can't wear pads until I think it's the 5th day on training camp. So there will be no contact drills and no pads, obviously. So things like, okay, how does the offensive line look? How does the defensive line look? How do the defensive backs look against the receivers in press man coverage? All that stuff, we won't be able to see that because it's not allowed. But there are things we will be able to take a look at and kind of gauge where things are standing. All right, so let's get into that list. First thing I think we have to cover is injuries. All right, so there were several guys that ended on IR last year, Bobby Okereke being one, Paulson Adebo, who was on IR with the Saints. So how much are these guys going to be cleared to do? And were there any other guys that maybe had some off-season surgeries that we didn't know about, or maybe that we did know about? How soon are they going to be on the field, and what are they going to be able to do? So that's always a topic of great interest is, who's able to do what, especially those amongst the injured players from a year before. So as I understand it, I think Paulson Adebo might be limited. He'll do like individual drills and stuff like that. I don't know how much he's going to do in terms of, team drills, but, that's something we're going to take a look at, obviously, when we get out there for the voluntary OTAs. And that's the other thing, a lot of people are going to make a big deal about the attendance. And the thing to remember with the OTAs is that sometimes the injured players are kept inside away from the media. So even though it looks like they're not out on the field, they might be in the building. And the second thing is it is a voluntary, session. OTAs are voluntary. And just because the guy doesn't show up on the day that the media is there doesn't mean that the guy hasn't been there before or the guy won't be reporting the next day. So, I'm sure you're going to see reports about attendance, and I would urge you to take them with a grain of salt because I can't imagine there's going to be anybody who's going to sit out in, protesting for a new contract or anything like that at this stage. So just keep that in mind. But injuries, again, a big thing. Where is everybody, especially those that ended with this season on IR? Where are they in their rehab? All right. So along those lines, I mentioned Paulson Adebo. I'm curious to see the new look defensive secondary, and in particular, how Marquand Manuel, the new defensive secondaries coach, works with those guys. All right. Does he introduce some new drills? How do they look? What's going to be the depth? Are any position changes in the mix? Trey Hawkins is returning from a back injury. We spoke about injuries before. Where's he going to fit in? Are they going to rotate guys? Are they going to keep, the quarterbacks on, is a Debo, for example, if he plays in the team drills, is he going to be on Malik Neighbors? Just how is that all going to shake out? And we can maybe get a kind of an idea of, the coverage and just, how these guys look in the defensive secondary. Because quite honestly, for as much love as the defense got in the offseason, I'm still a little squeamish about the defensive secondary, and in particular the cornerbacks position. Do they have enough depth there? I need to see it to believe it. All right. I'm not sold on it just yet. I think they have some talent, but, if heaven forbid somebody goes down, then what do they do? So that's the one position group that I'm really still kind of squeamish about on the Giants defense. All right. Moving on to item number 2. Obviously, Jaxson Dart. Going to be a lot of eyes on Jaxson Dart, who had a very, very strong rookie mini camp, despite the fact that they didn't do any 11-on-11 drills, nor did they have a pass rush. So in this one, there will be a pass rush, although, again, nobody's going to hit the quarterback. Nobody's going to touch the quarterback. But there will be something of a semblance, which is where, again, if you see that the defense dominated the offensive line, just keep that in mind. The offensive line can't, again, physically block these guys. So I would take any reports of the defensive pass rush dominating, I would take those with a grain of salt. But, the question for me with Jaxson Dart is he going to see any snaps with the first team offense? Now, I don't think he will. I think the focus is going to be on continuing to get Russell Wilson, comfortable with the offense, maybe getting Jameis Winston some first team reps as well, but we might see Jaxson Dart get an opportunity to throw to Malik Neighbors or to Darius Slayton or to Wan'Dale Robinson. All right. So I'm going to be curious to see how they distribute the snaps amongst the quarterbacks. And in particular, when Jaxson Dart gets his turn, how does he do with his opportunity? Now, he's been, since the rookie minicamp, he's been, as far as I know, at the Giants facility every day. He's been studying, learning the offense, working with, Wilson and Winston and Tommy DeVito. So you like to think he's going to continue to get better and better and better as time goes on. So it'll be nice to see if there's any noticeable difference in how he's throwing the ball in the OTAs versus how he was maybe throwing it to in the rookie minicamp when he was throwing to guys that maybe he didn't throw to ever before in his career. So, all right. The next thing we're going to take a look at, obviously, is Abdul Carter and what kind of snaps he gets. And by that, I mean, is he going to line up primarily as an outside linebacker? Is he going to be on the weak side? Is he going to be on the strong side? Is he going to get any snaps at inside linebacker? They're going to have him dropping into coverage. What exactly are they going to have him do? Maybe they have him do a little bit of everything. And if so, how does he look with everything that is expected to get thrown his way? So Abdul Carter is definitely going to be someone that I think is going to draw a lot of interest, being a number 1 draft pick, being as versatile as he is, and just, based on how they probably intend to use him in the defense, because, the guy can do so much. And, how's he going to look? How's his step, that first quick step that he has? So many other little things about Abdul Carter and how he basically, looks now that he's mixing in with the veterans. And, oh, by the way, is he going to pair up with Thibodeau? Is he going to pair up with Burns? Are they going to mix it in? So these are some other things that we can keep an eye on and see how the Giants kind of play it out. All right, I've got more coming up on my list, and I'll get to those right after this. Hey, Giant fans, ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so that you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, and even plan long-term goals. Since I've started using Monarch Money, I have a better handle on where my earnings go every month, and I've been better able to budget my monthly spending. So go on and take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use promo code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, and that code is LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, for half off your first year. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And again, this week we have OTAs on Wednesday. So that will be my Wednesday show. As soon as I get back into the office, I'll sit down and I'll record something for you, obviously. And also, you'll want to check out New York Giants on SI for any stories that come from the pressers and whatnot. So that's coming up this week, as well as, we continue to be 5 days a week, still plenty of football to cover. So as long as there's football, we are here for you on the Locked On Giants podcast. All right, let's get back to our list of things to watch, things I'll be watching at the OTAs. And for those of you wondering, yes, the OTAs are closed to the public. All right, so you won't be able to come in and see it. You'll have to kind of wait till training camp before you could see the Giants practicing and how they look. And by then, you should probably see a more polished group, I would say. And plus, for what it's worth, again, because there's no pads allowed and no contact allowed, you're probably better off waiting till training camp anyhow. So I know a lot of people, usually ask me that question, are OTAs open to the public? And the answer is no. So anyway, let's get back to the list of things that I'll be watching at the OTAs, all right, as we preview OTAs 2025. All right, the next thing on my list is the defensive line rotation. The Giants put a lot, and I mean a lot, of resources to the defensive line, which, was not a surprise, but, you figured they were going to create some competition given how the defensive line had its share of struggles last year, especially whenever Dexter Lawrence came off the field. So how is that unit going to look in terms of how they're lining guys up? So are we going to see, for example, Rakeem Nunez-Roches, who was the starter last year, is he going to line up next to Dexter Lawrence? Is it going to be the rookie Darius Alexander? Is it going to be someone else? Where are we going to see Chauncey Golston play? Is he going to stand up, or is he going to have his hand in the dirt? So there's just so many question marks. And again, a lot of different guys brought in. Roy Robertson Harris, Jeremiah Ledbetter was brought in. So the idea is for the Giants to build a deep rotation at defensive line, because last year, and quite honestly, the year before that, they really didn't have that. So again, if Dexter Lawrence came off the field, it was like you just knew what the opponent was going to do. They were going to run right at that spot where Dexter had been. So as I've said many times on this show, Dexter can't do it by himself, as good as he is. So we will see how the rotation kind of plays out with the defensive line. And keep in mind, whatever the rotation is that we report on Wednesday, it's subject to change. All right. Jobs are not going to be won or lost during the OTAs, contrary to maybe what you might have read or what people have said. They're not won or lost, but you're going to get an idea of how the competitions are shaping up. And certainly defensive line, that's going to be one of the highlights as far as the competition, given the number of players that they have at that unit. All right. This one is more of a coaching thing. And, it might be premature on this one, but I'm going to mention it anyway. And that is, who's going to be on the radio calling the plays? All right. Now, during the rookie camp, it was Mike Kafka. Will it be Kafka again, or will it be Brian Dable? That's an interesting question, because look, when we go back to the rookie camp, Dable gave Kafka that assignment, I suspect, because Dable wanted to be with Jaxson Dart after every throw, before every throw. He basically attached himself to Dart's hip. So Kafka basically called the plays for the other quarterbacks, none of whom obviously were signed. So the question now becomes, is it going to be Kafka doing it again on the radio, or is Dable going to take it back? Because now remember, they've got Russell Wilson, who will probably take the bulk of the snaps with the first team. Jameis Winston will get a lot of snaps, I'm sure. Jaxson Dart will get snaps. So will Kafka be on the radio? Will it be Dable? Or will maybe Dable split it to where he's on the radio with, with Wilson and Winston taking the snaps, and maybe he comes off the radio for when Dart takes any snaps. So, what I'm getting at is, will there be a clue as to who's going to call the plays in 2025? I don't think we'll be able to make that determination, but still it bears watching to see who might be on the radio and who's calling the plays, and especially if that person calls the plays throughout the entire practice, because it could be an indication. Because, you go back the last couple of years, whoever was on the radio in the springtime ended up being on the radio in the summertime and then into the season. So that's just something to keep an eye on. If, Dable is going to give that up, or is he going to keep it? And I would not be surprised if he does give the play calling back to Kafka, because again, if Dable is going to be heavily involved in working with Jaxson Dart and developing him, you probably want to take that off your plate and give it to Kafka, who has proven he could do it and do it at a decent enough level, so that now you're free to work with Dart. You're free to also visit with the defense and visit more with special teams, two areas that really, fell off a little bit last year. So that's something to keep an eye on. All right, continuing onward, we're going to get our first look at Evan Neal at right guard. All right, so how far along is he? Is that position better for him? So that'll be something I'm sure a lot of people will want to take a look at. I know I will as well. And along those lines, will Marcus Bowe play right tackle, or will they work him inside at guard? Because look, the right guard position, I think we can all agree, that's going to be a position up for grabs. Even though they brought back Greg Van Roten, the incumbent, that position, I suspect, is up for grabs. It's not necessarily going to be Van Roten's in training camp. He's going to have to defend it. And obviously, you've got Jay Kubas who's going to compete for it. You've got Evan Neal who will compete for it. Josh Azudu will probably compete for it. If they decide to play Marcus Bowe at guard instead of tackle, he'll compete for it. So there's going to be competition for that role. We won't know, though, again, until the pads go on and contact is allowed. But, Evan Neal, what we will be able to look at is the drills, the individual drills, assuming that the drills aren't all the way out on the backfield. But we'll be able to take a look at, his pad level. We'll be able to take a look at the footwork and just, the little things that, come with playing guard. And is operating in less space going to be more beneficial to him moving forward? So that's something, obviously, to keep an eye on for the OTAs, is how Evan Neal kind of, works at that right guard spot. Okay. Next thing, Russell Wilson. All right. There'll be our first look at Russell Wilson throwing the ball. All right. So, I'm not expecting anything fancy, but, how is Wilson's connection with the receivers? How is he with making checkdowns? Now, I do expect, as was the case last year, I think we will see more 11 on 11 than we will 7 on 7s, because really 7 on 7 drills, they've got some value, but not quite the value that 11 on 11 has. And even though, they're not working with pads, remember, this is a Giant team that has to come out of the gate quickly in 2025. They cannot afford to look like, they're still in preseason mode, which is how they've looked the last couple of years. So the way to get them ready is to do the 11 on 11 stuff. And I don't think, in the past, they've done enough of that. So I'm curious to see how that works out. I'm curious to see how Russell Wilson looks with, throwing the ball to the receivers, to Malik Neighbors. I'm curious to see how the receivers look. All right, that's another thing to look at. Is Jalen Hyatt finally going to get more of a role in the offense after kind of, being pushed to the back, if you will, last year? You know, and speaking of receivers, also they brought in a bunch of other receivers. So are they gonna, are any of these guys that they brought in, the Zach Pascals, the Lil Jordan Humphreys, are they gonna take, where are they in the pecking order? So, you know, just paying attention to who gets what kind of reps, how many reps, in what order, kind of will give you a little idea as to maybe how they're thinking in terms of a summer training camp depth chart. It's gonna, it's not something that's going to be set in the first practice, the first OTA that we get to see, or the second or the third. It's not going to be set probably in the mandatory minicamp that comes up next month. But you kind of get a feel for who's looking good, who's not, and maybe how things are going to play out as we go on through the spring, the summer, and ultimately the preseason. All right, we got a few more coming up, and we'll get to those right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. We're talking OTAs. The Giants OTAs start on Tuesday. Media is in the building on Wednesday. But here's a list of, we're going over a list of things that might be of interest to people. Even though there's no contact, even though there's no pads, there's still things to keep an eye on, because they can, set the tone, if you will, for training camp. So let's continue with a couple more. Running back 2. All right. So we can pretty much say that Tyrone Tracy is going to be the starting running back, having passed Devin Singletary on the depth chart. But who's going to be RB2? Is it going to be Singletary or is it going to be Cam Scatterboot? Now, again, because there's no pads and no contact, we won't be able to see the running game. But some of what we'll be able to see, obviously, are the drills. We'll be able to see things like, them catching passes out of the backfield, which last year was, something they didn't do as well as they should have. So where do they kind of stack up? The feeling has been that, ultimately Cam Scatterboot is going to pass Devin Singletary on the depth chart. I think it's too soon to say because it's going to come down to pass pro. And until we see otherwise, Devin Singletary, pretty good at pass pro. All right. So until Scatterboot can prove that he can do it better, I think, RB2 is going to be Singletary to start. But keep an eye on Scatterboot. I think Scatterboot will eventually pass Singletary on the depth chart for that 1-2 punch with Tyrone Tracy. So, that's something we might have to wait, like I said, until we get into the summer when the pads go on. But there are little things, like I said, the drills we'll be able to see. We'll be able to see the pass catching drills and just be able to talk to some of the coaches and kind of get a feel for how these guys are developing. Because I do believe, as part of the media access, not necessarily on Wednesday, but coming up probably, I think, during the mandatory minicamp, we will be able to talk to the position coaches and really kind of get a feel for where everybody is in terms of their development. All right. The final thing to keep an eye on is any new wrinkles that are added on offense or defense. All right. So let's start with the offense. Do they line up, for example, with more 12 personnel? Do they go with more 11? How many times are they maybe looking to run 2 running backs and do like 21 or 20? Basically looking at last year's trends, what they did on offense, what personnel they lined up in most of the time. And then, are there any changes, anything that they're experimenting with? Are they maybe lining up, for example, Wan'Dale Robinson? Is he going to be more of an outside receiver? Are they going to put Malik Neighbors more in the slot? So these are all little like wrinkles and stuff that you can look for when they line up to do, their 11 on 11, assuming that they do 11 on 11, which I think, again, they will. So that's what you can look for on the offensive side of the ball. And then on defense, are they going to go with a 2-man D-line front? Are they going to be more nickel? And the nickel is Micah McFadden going to be the nickel linebacker, or are they going to use Abdul Carter in that role? So there's all kinds of little nuances with the new personnel that is coming in, that is going to maybe inspire the coaching staff to do things a little differently, mix things up a little bit. And, look, the spring is the time to experiment with different looks and different formations and whatnot. How many of those actually make the cut and make it over to training camp? That remains to be seen. So, but there's always little wrinkles that are added every year based on the personnel that they bring in and the personnel that they have returning and how they kind of mesh it together. So these are all things that, we can keep an eye on and see how it's shaping up. It doesn't mean that that's what we're going to see again, when week 1 rolls around, but it could give us a little indication as to what they want to do. And more importantly, if the guys that they try doing these wrinkles with, if they don't really, deliver the goods, maybe they say to themselves now, okay, we got to upgrade at this spot or for this role, or maybe we just scrap a particular formation or a particular look. So these are all things to keep an eye on. There'll be plenty more, I'm sure. Obviously you want to come out of the OTAs without any injuries. That would be kind of nice, right? Given this team has been so injured. And that's, another thing real quick is what are they doing for stretching and post-practice stretching and all that stuff? Does that change any much? So these are all things I'd like to see. I'm also interested in hearing, from the players. I'm sure there'll be a bunch of players brought to the podium. We'll probably hear from a lot of the veterans and whatnot, as well as some of the rookies. I imagine Jaxson Dart will be on the podium. So much still to come. And we, of course, will have it for you all here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Hope you will tune in. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition. Again, thank you, as always, for tuning in. And make sure you keep it here all week long. We'll have shows for you every day this week. Make sure for your second listen today, you check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, hosts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, Giant fans, I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.